Because today we're going to talk about the power of the table. Last week we realized, it was really amazing to me as I was going through this message, and we talk about the anxiety and some of the fears that we have, and is there going to be enough? Is God going to provide? Or all of these things, and we talked about, man, if God was able to provide for the birds of the air or the lilies of the field or all of those things, how much more does God care for us? Because there's a lot of times that worry and anxiety tend to get the best of us. But the truth is that we can live from that place of trust. We can live from that place understanding, that peace that passes all understanding. And I know that when we came to the altar or the end of the service and just that time where you respond, man, several of you responded, I just need some more peace. I need some more peace. There's a lot of things that are happening. And again, we trust in God. God is our peace. His provision doesn't just stop with our needs being met. His care overflows into something so much deeper. And so today, as we talk about what that provision looks like and how God always ministers to us and how he's always aware of what our needs are, because there's power in the table. There's power in the table. So Father, as we just dive into this message today, God, I thank you that you invite us to your table of grace. God, I'm so thankful, Lord, that you help us to open our tables in our lives so others may find you and they may find that healing, that belonging, and that hope that only you can bring. In the name of Jesus, I pray. And everybody says, amen. Well, one of the most visible ways that we can maybe think about God's abundance or experience that abundance is really at the table. And so I know we've got a picture of a massive table there, and we got a little visual up here of what a table looks like, and like you needed to know, right? Man, that's a table? Really? Well, I want to just tell you that the table really isn't just a place to eat. It's not. Well, it's a place where you gather. It's where stories are told, where wounds can be healed, and where relationships are formed. And I think about, I was talking to our team a little bit before in our prayer time this morning, and I sent a message to my brothers and sisters last night, and I said, hey guys, when we were growing up, what was the one thing that you remembered about our table growing up? And I was really, in fact, I got a little emotional. I began to think about it because in the home that I grew up in, meal times were so important to my mom and my dad. My dad made sure that we all gathered at the table in the evening. We could do whatever we wanted all day long. I mean, how I grew up in a rural area, and there was times my mom kicked us out of the house after breakfast, and we didn't show up until dinner. And it was just that time. You can do all you want, but you better be your tail better be in a seat when it's time for us to meet for a meal. And so it was always an important time as we were growing up. And I think about how important it is and how, again, like we could be doing all we wanted, but when it was time to sit down at the table, it was time. And I've got 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. And so there's 7 of us around a table in our house. And I remember those times of sitting around that table and 7 of us, 5 of us, 5 kids, 7 years between me and my oldest brother. I'm the youngest. You've heard the stories. If not, I'll be happy to tell you them again. I will. But when we would sit around that table, it was always a time where we would fight, right? Or we would get corrected, or there's times that we would have conversation. There was times that we had guests in our home. My dad was really big about inviting people to come and have a meal with us. There was times, I remember my sister's boyfriend sitting at the table with us and just sitting amazed at what the 5 kids could do and what they could consume in just a matter of a few moments. And, we always talked about seconds. Man, seconds in my home, it was like you got it when it around the first time because there wasn't going to be anything on that plate when it came around the second time. And I was the fat kid. So I'm just telling you, all right? There was times that, you ate what was put in front of you and stuff. I'll never forget tuna casserole. Anybody ever eat tuna casserole? All right. The kids in the room are like going, what? Yeah, exactly. Or sometimes it was just pinto beans. I don't know, but it was just that moment that we would gather around that table and, there was chaos. It was noisy. And again, maybe not every conversation was perfect. But what I remember most is a sense of unquestionable belonging. Unquestionable belonging. No matter what happened during the day, we knew we had a seat. waiting for us. In fact, I asked my brothers and sisters, I sent them a text, and I asked them to send me just, hey, if you have some memories of what it was like to gather around our table, can you share those with me? And so they sent me some texts, and I want to just read a couple of them to you. My sister Karen says, I often think of those times as well, because I told them how fond my memories were. And says, I even remember where each of us sat. You know, we all had our space. It was Dad, Mom, me. I had to be next to my mom because I had to be within arm's reach. And then, and then we would go around the table. And then again, if there was guests, we would always make sure there was room at the table. And then if we, like on holidays and Thanksgiving and Christmas, there was the kids' table. Anybody have to sit at the kids' table? Yeah, I was the youngest. There wasn't a question about whether. And then one time I weaseled my way onto the adult table and I wanted back at the kids' table. So anyway, it was just how that worked. My brother Scott said this, dinner around the table gave me a sense of identity and belonging in the family. There was a place for each of us. I loved the times when Dad would invite other families to join us. And then my brother David said it was so important for our dad to make sure the family was gathered around because my dad was the pastor of his home. And he said, hey, I'm going to make sure my family's gathered around this table. And I know that my dad would get us up at 7 in the morning before we went to school, and we would sit around that table, and he would open up his Bible, and he would make each of us read, and we would have a moment. The table was a place where we knew that there was acceptance and belonging. Let's see, my sister Tammy, as she just said, she goes, man, it united us. It reminded us of an unspoken way that we are part of something bigger than just ourselves and fending for ourselves and not just doing our own thing. It felt safe. I loved it when we laughed and when we prayed together as a family. It was comforting. Somehow it was also unspoken visual of Dad being our covering and our provider. And so as I sat there and I looked through those things, I got emotional as I was reading those because those were just fond memories of just remembering that time. And you've heard my story. My dad passed away when I was young. But it was so important to him. And I think about the way that I raised my kids. It wasn't always the most important thing. And it was always, especially now in the world that we live in, we get so locked into these. And it's not such a place. And then others I've asked, it's just like, man, our lives were busy. It was chaotic. It was just like grab and go whenever we ate in our meal times. Others, you might have had that moment. And maybe you grew up in a home where, man, we really didn't even have a table. It was just those things. Well, I just want to spend the next few moments just talking about the power of the table and what that looks like and what God is teaching us, because as we go through this today, I want you to see that God's table is always bigger than what we expect. And we talk about as we go through this, he invites the stranger, he invites an outsider, he invites that unlikely guest. He's willing to invite that EGR. Go back to last message series. All right, you guys aren't with me. I get it. All right. But when we make room at the table, we're joining God and extending his welcome to a world that's so hungry for love, that's hungry for belonging, that's hungry for hope. In the world that we're in, it's just like, man, we've got to have some glimpse of hope. And as we've shared with you, and I'm not trying to preach doom and gloom, but I'm just telling you that we have a hope in who God is for us. And at God's table, there's always a seat. At God's table, there's always a seat for you. You see, why does God use something as ordinary as a meal to reveal something so extraordinary about his love? Well, can I tell you the first thing is this: the table creates belonging. The table creates belonging. I think about a kid. As we sat around that table, we knew that we belonged. We knew that we had a space. We knew that we could talk and we could have fellowship and we could eat a great meal or we could eat a bad meal. But it was always about, we always were together. And so that table creates belonging. When you sit down at a table with others, something shifts. A meal slows us down. I know in our house, sometimes we ate so fast. And I remember like one time my sister brought her boyfriend over, and it was great because we grew up in a rural area and we had cows. And there was times I didn't know what cellophane wrapped meat was until I was in junior high. And so my mom would go out in the freezer and get that white packet. It says chuck roast on it, or it says hamburger, or whatever. And so we'd go get that, and there would be times, and we would name our cows. And so, so when it was time for whatever, we'd be sitting around the table, and I remember one of my sister's boyfriends commenting, She goes, what do you mean? Are we eating Casper today? It was like, well, you don't see him out in the field anymore, do you? All right, anyway. And so, don't look at me like that. I get it. But again, it's one of those things. It invites conversation and it invites a shared experience. Hebrews 13:2 says this. It says, don't forget to show hospitality to strangers. For some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. Man, how cool is that? So when we extend God's love and we show his love outside of ourselves and to those maybe in greater need, we're showing again that the table isn't just about food, it's about people. It's about creating a space for others to feel seen, to feel welcomed, and to feel valued. One of my sisters reported, she put a little side note on it too. She goes, you know what, it was a place, sometimes I didn't like being at that table, but I always felt valued. I always felt like I belonged. I had a sense of security when I sat around that table. And so I think about that. When we find that we're welcomed, we're valued. I think about this. In Jesus' ministry, how often do we find him at a table? How often do we see where Jesus is sitting down with anybody that would sit down with him? He would have a meal with them. He ate with tax collectors. He ate with Pharisees. He ate with his disciples. He ate with strangers. Meals were never just casual hangouts. They were moments where walls came down, where outsiders became insiders, where dignity was restored. It was a place that you felt valued, that you could sit across from each other. When we were setting this up, I know we were talking about, well, let's just do one side. I go, well, I don't want to create the Last Supper. But as you sit across from each other, that you can look into the eyes of somebody you're talking to. And, and also it's in proximity where you could get the food. But, again, you would have that face-to-face conversation. And it really wasn't about where you were from. It really wasn't about where you've been or where you're going. It was about that moment. And so, again, I think that when we talk about that, it didn't matter where you were from or what your background was or what your reputation was. You were equal. You were sharing the same bread. You were drinking the same drink. You were drinking from that same cup. You were in that same space and time together. And I think about for us, I think that's what we long for. We want to belong. You hear us say all the time, a tagline in our church is a place that you belong. Because I think that you want to feel belong. I want to feel like I belong. And we want to be in that space where I know that I belong in God's house. I know that I belong at this table because he's given me a seat there. He's given you a seat there. And you belong at that table. Because God knows about us. He created us. He created us for community. He didn't create us for isolation. Again, that's why he prepares a table for us. And he calls us his own. He doesn't invite us because we've earned it. He doesn't invite us because we proved ourselves worthy. He invites us because we belong to him. Because we belong to him. We come as we are. And when we understand this, we find ourselves more willing to pull out an extra chair for somebody else. And I wrote this down. Gratitude grows when we remember that God made room for us. And generosity flows when we make room for others. Right? Does that make sense? Generosity grows when we remember that God made room for us. And that generosity will flow when we make room for others. That's the power of the table. It creates belonging. It creates belonging. I think about even in the home I grew up in, we all had a job to do. Some of us had to set the table and we had to come and make sure that we had the plates in the right place and make sure that they were clean. I love cleaning forks. Whatever it was, there's a spot on that one. Let me get it. And put it back. I was the little brother, okay? Don't put it past me. I made sure it looked good. Whether you got sick later, that was up to you. But anyway, it creates that belonging. And then at the end of the meal, we each had a job. Whose turn is it to clear the table? Who is it to load the dishwasher? Well, the dishwasher isn't working. My dad would say, no, it's working great. You've got a right arm and a left arm. Get to work. Right? It wasn't about whether it was working or not. It was like, oh, no, you got two hands. You make it work. And so we all had our jobs, and me and my brother Scott would always end up in a water fight somehow. I don't know how that happened. Throwing dish soap in each other's face or whatever it is. But the power of the table, it creates that belonging. And then what does the table do? The table brings healing. Belonging is the first gift of the table, then healing is the second. I love what Luke chapter 14, verse 12, it tells us not only to invite friends, family, wealthy neighbors to the meals. He says this, then he turned to the host. When you put on a luncheon or a banquet, he said, don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that'll be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. You see, Jesus knew that the table could become a place where wounds could be healed and where dignity could be restored. He knew that if you had the seat at the table with God, that healing would flow, and that why Christ came for us was to show us that love and that belonging. Again, that could be restored. How crazy is this? The people that mentions the poor, the sick, the outcasts, those who were often pushed out, they were the unseen and the unwanted. But at God's table, they're not only welcomed, they're honored. They're not only welcomed, they're honored. I've ministered or I've talked with so many people, and they sit there and they talk about, man, I wish I was visible. I feel like I'm invisible. I don't feel like I matter. I don't feel like I'm seen. And when you sit across from somebody at the table, you can't help but see. You can't help but recognize. You can't help but honor, because you're all equals. It doesn't matter. At God's table, you're seen. You're accepted. You're welcome. You belong. Because Jesus is showing us that the table is a place where brokenness will meet grace. Right? He's showing us where that brokenness meets grace. It's a place where there's no shame, because somebody finally says, you belong here. You matter. You are not forgotten. You see, we all know what it feels like to carry wounds into a room. We all know that feeling that when those things happen, that all of a sudden you're like, man, you don't understand. Maybe it's wounds of rejection. Maybe it's failure. Maybe it's loss. But when someone looks us in the eye across from the table, listens, and shares a meal with us, looking face to face, eye to eye, healing begins. Healing begins because all of a sudden you feel valued, you feel recognized. That's what the gospel is all about. When we're sharing hope, we're sharing love, we're creating an environment where God's Spirit and where God's love and God's grace can be restoration. You see, we don't heal people on our own. Obviously, it's the power of God in us. But it's recognizing that He's working through us. It's that space that God can meet us and others. And so just like Jesus, who used meals as moments of redemption, we're called to see our tables as places where broken hearts can be made whole. I hope that you're tracking with me, because it's really not just a physical table, although yes, a physical table is amazing. But when we understand we're talking about God's love and acceptance, it's even that one-on-one conversation that we have with others, or maybe one-on-one conversations that we have with each other in this room, understanding that you matter and what you go through matters, and God sees it. And so it's more than just sitting down at a physical table, but it's recognizing that there's a place in God's kingdom for everyone. It's not an exclusive club. It's like God said, I came for everyone. I gave Jesus to give His life for everyone, that none should perish. And it's accepting that love that He brings. So again, the table isn't just a picture. The table represents so many things in our lives. And the third thing is this: the table extends God's kingdom. So if the table creates belonging and it brings healing, it also does something even bigger. As I just mentioned, it extends God's kingdom. There's always space. I love that. That table never seems like it never ends. That's the picture. That's the picture that we need to have, is understanding that there's space for us. It extends His kingdom. In Luke chapter 14, a little further down that I just read, He's telling about this great banquet. In verse 15 of chapter 14 of Luke, it says, hearing this, a man was sitting at a table with Jesus. Sitting at a table with Jesus. All right, what a blessing it'll be to attend the banquet in the kingdom of God. And Jesus replied with this simple little story. He said, a man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to tell the guests, "Come, the banquet is ready." But they all began making excuses. One said, "I have just bought a field and must inspect it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I want to go try them out." How do you try out oxen? I don't know. I don't know how that works. "And I want to try them out. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." And so the servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was furious and said, "Go quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." After the servant had done this, he replied, "There is still room for more." So his master said, "Go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges and urge anyone you find to come, so that the house will be full. For none of those I first invited will get even the smallest taste of my banquet." You see, that's the thing in our world. We've got so many things that are happening and so many things that distract us that even though the master's hands are open and he says, "Will you come?" And they're like, "Oh man, I got to go try out my oxen." I got to make sure they're firing on all cylinders. Or, I just bought some land. I want to go check it out. And we can come up with all these things, but Jesus is saying, the door's open. Come on. There's a meal waiting for you. Come in. Come on. He's telling us that God's table is never closed. His kingdom is wide open to those that the world often overlooks. You see, there's lots of people that think they're too far gone or too unworthy or too broken. And they are the very ones that God brings in to fill his house. You see, Jesus calls us, his people, to carry those invitations. He calls us to sit there and say, "You know what, man, what I've done for you, I can do for others. The healing that's happened in your life, I can do for others. You just have to extend that invitation. You have to understand that there's a place for you in God's family. And every extra chair we sit out, every meal we share, every moment of hospitality we extend becomes a preview of the great feast that is coming." Again, I think about my story in my home. My dad always made sure. He said there was always an extra chair at our table. It didn't matter who it was. It didn't matter whether he just met them on the street. It didn't matter if it was somebody that, hey, this person doesn't really have a place to go, so will you invite them to come in and sit at our table? If I can open this chair, there it is. Will you invite them? There's always an extra seat at the table. There's always an extra seat at the table. And that's what God is saying to us. Will you go out? Will you bring those? There's always an extra seat. Again, as we talk about that great feast that's coming, that's the wedding supper of the Lamb. Every tribe, every tongue, every nation will gather around the table of Jesus. And we can gather at his feet and we're like, "Thank you for what you've done for me," as we celebrate communion today. And we can just look at our Savior and say, "Thank you for giving your life, for that salvation, for inviting me to sit at your table. Thank you for including me in that place that I belong." And so my question for you, are you willing to make room? Are you willing to see our tables not just as our own, but as an extension of God's kingdom? Because when we do, you understand the table becomes more than a meal. It becomes a mission. It becomes more than a meal. It becomes a mission. And we have to step back and take a step back and just think about what we've been talking about. And again, metaphorically, I'm talking about the table. It's not just a physical table. It's understanding that I'm inviting you into a place of rest of God, of what he's done for us. It's not a piece of furniture or a place to fill our stomachs. It's a space where God's presence meets our everyday lives. You see, at the table, belonging is created. People who once felt like outsiders discover that in Christ, they are welcome, they're loved, and they're given a seat. That healing began. Wounds that have lingered for years are met with compassion, grace. And at the table, God's kingdom is extended. I hope that you can see this. I hope that you understand that it's more than just a physical place. But it's recognizing that within us, especially in the world that we live in, you see, this is exactly what God has done for us. He welcomed us when we were outsiders. He healed us when we were broken. He's given us a place in his kingdom. And you need to understand that that's the good news. So as our team comes up, as we close out our time this morning, and maybe you have that visual and You're like, well, Pastor, Thanksgiving's still a week and a half away. I get that. But next week, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted you to have that visual of what the table looks like and that there is room at the table. If you guys need to sit down at the table, you're more than welcome to. There's no food. I thought about that. But I just want to challenge you because the power of the table is the invitation, not the menu. Not the menu. Have you ever invited somebody to dinner and their first words are, well, what are we having? What are we having? I'll never forget one time as we were getting ready for dinner, and our neighbor across the street, the girl my age, her name was Linda, and I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and I'm like, Mom, can I invite Linda over for dinner? And she goes, all we've got is pinto beans. And I'm like, Mom, let me ask her. Okay, anyway. But again, it doesn't matter. It's not about the menu. It's about the invitation. Maybe it's this week you start small and you think about, man, how can I invite one person that might be an outsider? Maybe somebody I work with. Maybe it's a neighbor. Or maybe, as you're leaving today and maybe God just puts it on your heart. I need to invite somebody to go have coffee with me this week as you're leaving. And maybe somebody in this room God's placed on your heart. And just simply say, hey, would you mind? Can we just go meet at Starbucks if you got time this week? Or you know what's happening in our house? Man, I've got all these crazy kids, but I'd love for you to come over for a meal. Let me minister to you, because the truth is yeah, we're a room full of people, but there's people in this room right now. And this might be you. Pastor, this is a lonely season for me. Man, this is going to be the first year that there's going to be an empty chair at my table. Or maybe this is the first year, that I've got family far away that I'm not going to get to see. Or maybe you're just like, I just don't like my family, and the challenge is going to be real when we gather around that table. And if God puts somebody on your heart that's sitting in this room, maybe it's you taking that step and saying, hey, let's go have coffee together. Let's have a meal together. Or maybe next week when we talk about Thanksgiving, and maybe there's some people that, man, this is just a lonely season. Man, come to my house. I've got an extra seat at the table. Well, there's 4 of us. I got extra 4 seats at my table. Because we all belong in God's house and we belong in His family. It's up to us to show who He is and His love. Because who God's placed in our lives, there's people that need belonging and need healing, and they need that invitation. Don't ever underestimate the power of a meal, because when God is at the table, anything is possible. When God is at the table. So Father,